morning and welcome to Shattering Myths, a program devoted to the largest growing segment of our society, to those of you who know that the world's political, religious, media, military, and economic institutions are rotten to the core, and that they are the problem, and therefore there will never be a religious, political, or military solution to what ails our planet. Our mission, therefore, is to look behind the headlines, to understand what is happening, and, as a result, in our second hour, to use evidence and reason to explore the Torah, because its covenant provides the only reliable answer. Our phone number, if you'd like to participate in this discussion at any time over the next 2 hours, is 877-300-7645. Yesterday in the news, there was a mention of Yellen and the fact that she is going to be approved by the U.S. Senate for the head of the Federal Reserve. It's kind of odd that the U.S. Senate would choose the head of the Federal Reserve, since the Federal Reserve has nothing to do with the U.S. government. It is not a government agency. It is a independent private cartel, a for-profit making business. It is unconstitutional in addition to all of that. But the thing that was interesting, struck my interest yesterday, was the comment that she'll be approved because she's going to follow in the footsteps of Bernanke, and she's going to continue the policy of low interest rates and quantitative easing. That's worth considering, just because those two things happen to be tied together. The only reason that interest rates are low now, after having poured trillions, probably in the range of $10 trillion into the U.S. economy, therefore devaluing our currency by that amount, is that the Fed has become the largest purchaser, and we'll put purchaser in quotes, of treasuries. And it has done so through this magic of quantitative easing. They've recognized that the United States is so broke that no one wants to service our debt, that the Chinese have had their fill. The Japanese are at a position where they don't have any appetite either. The risk associated with the U.S. default at $17 trillion in debt, and actually closer to $60 trillion when you consider the unfunded mandates, is so high that there is no justification for investing in T-bills at low interest rates. The interest rates would have to be above 10% to justify the associated risk. And so if the interest rates on $17 trillion were at 10%, you would triple the existing annual deficit. And by tripling it, you would then need to borrow much more money than we currently seem unable to borrow. So thereby the magic of quantitative easing continues, where the Fed magically creates money out of nothing, which they claim for themselves, which then they in turn use to buy U.S. government bonds, because no one else wants them. It is a game, a charade, that will come to a close, and when it does, it will be an inevitable crash. Yesterday we were talking about a story that the Washington Post published on Syria. And since Syria serves as the throttle and the catalyst for the next world war, I thought we'd spend a little more time investigating what the media was saying about this place. The next line in the CNN report reads, or excuse me, the Washington Post report reads, Syrian opposition activists, Syrian opposition activists. Now, before I read what they had to say, this is a term that the Washington Post will use regularly. And I would expect, because the media is all in collusion with one another, that others will follow suit. But what is an activist? This is a civil war. The players are the Assad government, which is essentially secular. So this is not a spokesperson for the Assad government. Then there are the Mujahideen jihadists. They would be comprised of two different camps, one allied with the secular government, that would be Hezbollah. They are Shiite Muslims. Then you have the Sunni Muslims, which are comprised of approximately equal parts foreign Sunni jihadists from all over the globe, but particularly from Saudi Arabia and from Libya. And you have homegrown Sunni Islamic jihadists. They are in opposition to the Assad government. On the sidelines, just getting slaughtered, you have some Christians. That's the composition of Syria. Now, there may be some liberals in Syria. I wouldn't doubt that at least 4 or 5% of the Syrian population might consider themselves to be political liberals, socialist, secular humanists, and those that the media might refer to an activist because they view the activist title as a positive denotation because they use it to describe those of like mind. But someone that represents a socialist secular humanist in Syria isn't associated with any side. They're not engaged in the battle. In fact, they would be the antithesis of an activist because they aren't engaged. They have no voice. They have no weapons. They have no side. There is absolutely zero possibility that someone who is a socialist secular humanist is going to magically prevail in Syria. So to suggest that there are political activists and that those activists are championing a noble cause is astonishingly misleading. We are presenting a fictitious picture of what is occurring. Now, let's continue now that we know that we have a mythical term being used to describe a mythical spokesperson. Syrian opposition activists. And again, there are no opposition activists. There are those who are active in opposition are Sunni jihadists. Period. They're terrorists. Said the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, ISIL. This is a name that is applied principally to the Awakening Council derivative. The United States, after failing to achieve anything worthwhile in Iraq, and after having stupidly given Iraq to Iran and therefore established by bumbling a Shiite theocracy in Iraq, decided that they recognized that the weapons they had provided now to the Iranian Iraqis, the Shiites, were going to be used to slaughter the Sunnis. And so, under the guise of telling the Sunnis to go out and kill al-Qaeda, which did not exist in Iraq prior to our invasion, Petraeus and the Bush administration came up with the idiotic idea of providing American small arms to the Sunnis in Iraq so that they could defend themselves against the military that we had provided for the Shiites in Iraq. Well, these Sunnis in Iraq saw this great opportunity to play jihad and earn bonus points with Allah, make their move towards the 72 virgins, and they took the American guns and ammunition and went across the porous border and saw to it that they were a major component of the jihadist fight against the Assad government. That's who the ISIL represents. This says they are allied to al-Qaeda. Now, the problem with that is, if the American media is going to advance the theory that the Ansar Sharia, which is the supporters of Sharia law, the Islamic terrorist organization that killed the American ambassador and 3 other Americans in Benghazi, if they're going to take the the tune, sing the tune that Ansar Sharia is not affiliated with al-Qaeda, when the Leaf of Allah, its founder, has copious letters that have been made public showing his devotion to Anwar al-Zawahiri, the remaining sole spokesperson for the original al-Qaeda, when there is no existing treasure chest of letters showing any support of ISIL for al-Qaeda, just one public statement as they tried to take control of the Nusra Front, the victory front of Islamic terrorists in Syria, then you are demonstrating pure hypocrisy. I mean, the Ansar Sharia is vastly more tied to Zawahiri than is the ISIL in Iraq, as is the ISIL in Syria. The fact of the matter is that any connection to al-Qaeda is a farce. It is one of these myths that causes journalists to suggest that there is an opposition activist that is somehow disassociated from Islam. Because anyone that is fighting, and 100%, not some percentage, 100% of those in Syria, whether they be foreigners or Syrians, who are picking up weapons to fight against the Assad regime, they are fundamentalist Sunni Muslims. There are no separate sides here. There's no distinct alliances. Now, that's not to say that the condition doesn't exist in Syria that exists in Libya, where rival warlords, rival gang leaders, rival terrorist organizations are at each other's throat. There's no distinction in their Islam. Their distinction is only in one group thinks that they ought to have more influence than another group. That's the nature of religious organizations. It's why the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, and the Copt Orthodox Christian churches all exist. There's no significant distinction between their doctrine, just who's in charge. We'll be back in a moment. So the media reports that Syrian opposition activists, which there are none, said that the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which is essentially a name that means nothing, they're simply armed Sunnis from Iraq that were part of the legacy of the Awakening Councils, which should be an incredibly black mark on Republicans in Congress, Petraeus and the Bush administration for coming up with such an idiotic scheme as the Awakening program. In fact, the moment that it was introduced, I told all who would listen that this would be the consequence of it. And it is the consequence of it. I guess the media still doesn't want to admit it, but that is the basis of the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. They are not allied to al-Qaeda, of course, because al-Qaeda didn't even exist in Iraq at the time of the American invasion and throughout most of the occupation. And this says they feature foreign jihadists. No, the name tells you who they represent. They are mostly Iraqis. They aren't foreign to this fight or to this territory. The United States brought it about. And it says featuring foreign jihadists among its commanders pulled back on Sunday from strong points, including Al-Dana and Atma and Idlib provinces that fighters from the Nusra Front and al-Rar al-Sham moved in. What they're describing here is that you've got a collection of jihadists that are at least communicating with one another. They have different sets of commands, but they're communicating with one another. One group pulled in, one group covered the bulk of the fighting. They are now allowing others to move in. It's a strategy that is being deployed here. They are communicating. The Nusra Front and Ahrar al-Sham are fundamentalist Muslim jihadists, just as is the ISIL. Then this quote from the opposition activist. The Islamic State is pulling out without a fight. Its fighters are taking their weapons and heavy guns. Now, by the way, for them to have heavy guns, who do you suppose supplied them with their heavy guns? Can you say Saudi Arabia? Can you say Qatar? You know, when you are living in an Islamic country that is a dictatorship, as was Iraq, as was Syria, is Syria, the population doesn't get heavy guns. They don't get any kind of guns. And so for them to have weapons, someone outside of Syria is supplying those weapons. Now, there's only two countries that are admitting doing so. Qatar and Syria. Why aren't we after them to shut down the supply of weapons to slow the carnage? The activist, Fararas Ahmad, said, he added that the ISIL, the Islamic State, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, fighters headed in the direction of Aleppo, where Assad troops have stepped up pressure on rebel forces who captured the city 18 months ago. So here they moved from one place, which was reasonably secure, to a place where the fighting, is the most intense. And rather than just saying they're communicating, these fundamentalist Muslim jihadists are all working together, no, this opposition activist wants to have the media believe, and the media is reporting that no one is simply surrendering. You know, they're saying we don't want to fight you anymore. We're just going to back out of the fight. No. They position from a area of low opposition to a period of to a place of high opposition. Another activist, oh boy, there's two of them, they're breeding. Abdallah, which means slave to Allah, al-Shika, which means leader, and it's a religious leader. Therefore, he is a fundamentalist Muslim by name. Said that some of the Syrian ISIL fighters, now that's really going the opposite direction with this. So the media wants you to believe that the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant is foreign fighters. And then you have this activist said that the Syrian fighters with the ISIL had stayed in place, but had switched alliances to the Nusra Front. Somebody is very confused, and they're missing the big picture. Looking, I guess, staring nose to nose with the trees, they have no clue what the nature of the forest is that surrounds them. This is Sunni versus Shia Islam. It is a proxy war. It is not hard to figure out who started it, nor why it is being fought. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're considering the errant reporting out of Syria. By way of background, the reason this story is important is because Syria is both the throttle and the catalyst for the next world war. And so the more we know about it, the better prepared we're going to be. I say that it is the catalyst and that it is a proxy war. Proxy wars are the things that usually blow up into world wars. And there's so many treaties and vested interests associated with it. The Syrian civil war is being fought between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, principally as the suppliers of weapons for the Sunnis, Iran is the principal supplier of weapons for the Shiites and also for the Assad regime. You have China and Russia on the side of the Syrian government because of their allegiances with Iran as a direct result of the oil and gas in the Caspian Sea region. And then you have the United States and Europe on the side of the jihadists. Now, in this war, there are no winners. There's no way to prevail. There is nothing that any outside influence can do except the opposite of what we're doing. Rather than supplying weapons, we ought to be denying weapons to the Syrians. They'll continue to kill each other. They'll just bludgeon each other with clubs and knives and the blunt ends of their guns, as opposed to machine guns and heavy weapons and bullets and bombs and rockets and missiles and this sort of thing. The reason now that it is the throttle is because Team Islam, a unified Islam, will immediately seek to destroy Israel. That will be their first agenda. And so the only thing that keeps Israel from another united attack against Israel, keeps the Muslims from a united attack against Israel, is the fact that they are fighting one another. And they're fighting one another for control of Islam in Syria. 85% of Muslims are Sunnis, 15% are Shias. America disrupted the power balance between them when it invaded Iraq and gave Iraq to Iran. And so the Sunnis are trying not only to put the Shias back in a bottle, but they're trying to use this opportunity to create a caliphate, to unite all Islam under the Sunni umbrella, and therefore to completely neuter the influence of Shia Islam. And when they do, the first thing they will do is attack Israel in unison. But the fact that they're fighting each other is serving as the throttle, the mechanism that is keeping this from boiling over into an unified Islamic assault against Israel and against the rest of the world in the next 5 to 10 years. So that is what is at stake here, and that's why it's essential, if we want to understand where the world is headed and how the next war is going to be waged, that we pay attention to what's actually happening in Syria, and we cut through the muck and myth of the journalistic reporting. We have Glenn that's called in from Philadelphia regarding this proxy war. Hello, Glenn.
Yes, good morning. Yeah, we've been seeing these convoluted proxy wars for quite some time now. And
Yes.
The last time that the world saw two modern nations actually pit air and naval forces against one another was the Falklands War, with
Yes.
devastating effects for both sides, and
Right.
with Britain ostensibly having won after having their navy pretty badly decimated,
Yes.
by Argentinian French Mirage fighters and such.
Right.
And so the powers, knowing the devastation of modern weapons pitted directly against each other, satisfies with these proxy wars in terms of manipulating the agenda and everything. I think there's reason to believe that this could go on for quite some time, especially given your time frame.
Yes.
Going up to about 2026.
Yes.
We have
I agree.
the 70th, and then because we know at some point, and from Isaiah, that at some point Damascus is going to be devastated. And
Yeah, absolutely.
It's my suspicion that might be, it's going to take something perhaps that horrific to drive them to the treaty table.
Yeah, it's interesting, Glenn. Let me interrupt you just a moment, Glenn, because which I want to make two comments based upon what you have said. One of the first comments is that the most telling proxy wars that the U.S. has been engaged in the last 50 years has been both Vietnam and in Korea. In Korea, the United States fought a proxy war against the communist Chinese, whom we had built up and armed in the latter stages of World War War II. That was a proxy war between the United States and the Chinese, fought in Korea. Then Vietnam was another proxy war. This was a proxy war between the United States and the Soviet Union, again, a country that we built up and armed in World War II. We ended up fighting a proxy war against them in Vietnam. Proxy wars are very, very savage things. The first war of Afghanistan during the Carter administration, when he boycotted the Moscow Olympics, was a proxy war. The United States started a proxy war using Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban to fight the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan. So proxy wars are bad things, and that's what's occurring in Syria. There is no resolution. You're right. There is an interesting note, though, that was something you've just said that I just recently came to grips with, and I'm not sure I fully appreciate all of its implications at this point. But I had taken my translations of Isaiah 17 and 18 out of the book Yahowah. And I took them out because they were in a end chapter that had way too much New Testament jargon in it, and which is way too much work at the time I was editing Yahowah to fix all of the problems with that chapter. So I just removed the chapter from the book. Well, I promised to go back and retranslate Yahowah, Isaiah 17 and 18, because it uses 12 different adjectives that vividly portray the United States, and its portrayal is really harsh. Our largest cities are destroyed because we loot Israel by thinning the nation at the waist. And so the reason that I interrupted you here is that you are correct in referencing Damascus. That Isaiah, Yahowah 17, begins with the destruction of Damascus. And when I first translated this, it was probably 10 years ago. That's when I began to write the 7-volume book Yahowah. And I had, at that time, understanding why Damascus would be destroyed didn't correlate with the subsequent destruction of the United States as a result of trying to have appeased fundamentalist Muslims. And that's basically what the prophecy portends, is the United States tries to appease the fundamentalist Muslims by giving them the high ground of the West Bank and the low ground of Gaza, thinning Israel at the waist. And just as Neville Chamberlain finds, when you give away other people's countries to satiate vicious nations like the Nazis, or in this case like the Muslims, you ignite wars. And that all made sense. What didn't make sense is why Damascus would be the starting point. But now if you realize, the United States came within a whisper of starting World War III when Obama wanted to bomb Damascus. And this proxy war, I agree, it's just going to continue to boil and rage on. And it is the place where the United States is going to and has already made its greatest blunders. It is the catalyst for this next world war. It's the place where all of this begins to materialize. If you understand what's happening in and around Damascus, you understand exactly how we get to the tribulation, World War III, the Magog War, the death of so many on this planet, why so many people have an interest in how this war, there's no way to explain how in the world the United States malfeasance in pushing a Palestinian state, and we're now saying that the United States is demanding that Israel create a Palestinian state by April of this year. How in the world does that lead to world war? Well, it leads to world war right through Damascus. You got the Chinese and Russians on one side, the United States and Europe on the other, and it is the hottest zone of the world right now, the most deadly place on earth, and it's being destroyed.
Oh yeah, it does make sense. I mean, I can, and the U.S. may be complicit in all this for quite some time. And we don't know whether Damascus will be devastated by the Israelis or by the U.S., or if Israel will be pressed into doing it, and then the U.S. will come in on the side of Israel, and then the U.S. be devastated by Russia and China. That seems quite possible. But again, I still think this is going to drag on for some time.
Yeah, I agree.
They can do nothing except.
Right. It's very much like
Yahweh allow it.
Yeah, and you're correct in the sense that that while I can't tell you all the ways that Damascus is going to be destroyed, it's pretty obvious that the United States is going to play a role, that Russia is going to play a role, that Sunni Muslims are going to play a role, that Shiite Muslims are going to play a role, and so the world's going to play a role in the destruction of Damascus. And we know for certain that Muslims never take responsibility for what they do to themselves. When a Muslim kills a fellow Muslim, they always blame non-Muslims. And so their rage here will be, first Damascus, then the world. And so right after the Sunnis, and the Sunnis will ultimately prevail here. I agree it's going to take a very long time, but it's like the U.S. Civil War. Ulysses S. Grant was a drunken idiot, a savage man, but he could count. He knew that if he lost every battle 3-1 or 4-1 in terms of casualties, that he'd win the war, because he did the math based on the populations. Well, I can do the math based upon the population of Sunnis versus Shiites, and they're going to continue to kill each other until the Shiites run out of jihadists. And so the ultimate victor here is going to be Sunni Islam, and it's going to be the establishment of a caliphate. And in the process, caliphate, and they will prevail, and it's going to be at great cost of life.
Isn't there also a prophetic reference to Persia destroying Elam, which it would be like Saudi Arabia, roughly? I should have researched that, but forgot.
Yeah, there's a reference. It's kind of interesting that Saudi Arabia is depicted in all of this as being destroyed. The places that you have depicted as being destroyed are Jordan, which is trampled underfoot, and that's easy to understand because Jordan forms alliances with Israel and is not actively engaged in the fight to destroy Israel. And so Muslims, jihadists, view Jordan as a group of traitors, and the truth be known, 2/3 of the population of Jordan are these mythical people known as the Palestinians, and most Muslim Arabs hate them, so they will be destroyed. But you're right, Saudi Arabia is also going to be destroyed, but I think it's Yahowah himself that does the destruction. He torches their oil fields. To Shattering Myths. We're talking about the mess that is Syria, the fact that it is a proxy war, the fact that Yahowah predicted that the path to Armageddon, the path to the tribulation, the path to the Magog War, which is World War III, would all pass through Damascus. And some 10 years ago, when I first went through this material to try to understand what God actually revealed prophetically to us about this, the culmination of man's abuse of this planet. I had no idea whatsoever why he would begin this testimony by talking about the destruction of Damascus. And now we see it play out right before our eyes. It's a proxy war. It is a religious war. It is a political war. It is a war that will ultimately engage the world's militaries. It is a war that will lead to, according to God, in the first phase of when this war spreads to the world, in the first phase, 1 out of every 4 people is going to die. And then in the second phase, 1/3 of those will die, which is half the world's population. This is a very serious event. And Glenn, when you witness these kinds of affirmations, I mean, here's something that was clearly and demonstrably tied to this march to the destruction of the United States, to the Magog War, this all-Islamic war against Israel. And 10 years ago, we could not, I don't think anyone on the planet could say, I understand why he began talking about this through the fall of Damascus. And here we have it right before our eyes. It certainly causes you to think, doesn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I wanted to commend you on that talking about a quarter of the world's population followed by a third, and the third was the same size as the first quarter, and that takes us down to half of the overall. I figured that out a number of years ago after going over it again and again and again until I finally got the relatively simple mathematical picture. But we rarely hear that elucidated.
Yes.
You know, that's exactly how that works.
Yeah, what I don't know, and I wish I did know, but I don't know, is that my sense is that over the final 3.5 years of the tribulation, my sense is a lot more than half of the world's population is going to succumb. And I don't know what the numbers are ultimately going to be, but I think it's going to be, I just think this planet's going to be ravaged. I think man is going to bring upon himself a huge bloodbath. And apart from a couple of direct interventions, almost all of the carnage in the tribulation is perpetrated by man upon man. Very little of it is an act of God. God's going to do a couple of things. He did say that he himself is going to have to intervene in the Magog War. When Muslims in unison, around 2027, come into Israel and their final assault of Israel, it's apparent now that Israel will be unable to defend itself. The United States supplies 24 times more weaponry to Israel's Islamic enemies than they do to Israel. And there's no longer a technological advantage. And so God predicts that Muslims are going to, right after a treaty is made to give up the West Bank to Muslims, God predicts that Muslims are going to move in with all manner of weaponry, and they will be in Israel about ready to destroy Jerusalem, and he says that he himself will have to intervene. So he's going to wipe out that advancing army. So that's a personal intervention. And then he talks at that time, Glenn, about the burning of Saudi Arabia. And it's the way that, and it's in the context of also of merchants and of oil, and so since oil and merchants and burning of Saudi Arabia are all mentioned, and so I don't know if it's the consequence of what he does in Israel to destroy the Islamic war machine or a personal act by Yahowah, but Saudi Arabia's influence.
The proverbial glass parking lot, yeah.
Yes.
One thing about Jordan, bringing the Jordanian royalty, of course, is always, westernized puppets,
Yes, they are.
And so you have this, and they have the connection between Jordan and Lebanon and Hezbollah. But the one thing I'm weary about hearing about the hundreds of thousands of rockets they're going to fire is, look, they're bottle rockets, they're little, Cox or STs, hobby rockets. Unless and until somebody gets a hold of something with some decent distance and payload and targetability, this is all hooey.
Yeah, with exception of what existed in Syria. Syria had some decent stash of intercontinental ballistic missiles and also of very sophisticated rockets. Iran has a reasonable stash of sophisticated rockets, and so there are some players that are hostile to life that have these kind of weapons.